Hold on.
It's on? Okay. So first of all, thank you, Matthew, for joining us today for this conversation. Matthew Crippen is this the right pronunciation of the name?
Yeah.
Okay. He's a visiting professor at Berlin School of Mind and Brain at the Humboldt University of Berlin. And he will be talking to us today about his recently published paper, Aesthetics and Action. Sorry about the cat.
Cool. Yeah,
Aesthetics and Action, Situations, Emotional Perception, and the Kuleshov Effect. I'd like to thank all the participants here today and my colleagues that have helped organizing this meeting, which is the first one actually in a series of seminars we plan to hold throughout the year. So stay tuned for the following months. I think we'll have very interesting talks as well. And after Matthew's presentation, which will take about 45 minutes, my colleague Felipe Carvalho, who is over there, and I will make some comments about the paper and the presentation. And afterwards, everybody's invited to ask questions. So thank you again, Matthew. It is a pleasure to have you here with us. And if you're ready, I guess we can start with your presentation. If you're going to use share your screen or something.
Sure.
Okay. I think
Guess everybody can see.
Yeah, yes, I can see.
Okay. Okay, so in this lecture, I'm going to focus on a cinematic phenomenon where audiences perceive different expressions on faces when identical shots are contextualized differently. And in doing so, I will include some experiments I did myself using performers who you typically wouldn't expect to be able to express facial expressions. So this includes Darth Vader. And so hence Giovanna scheduled this on May the 4th because it's May the 4th day, which is clever. I hadn't thought about that, but I'll also look a little bit at non-primates. And again, my aim is to highlight the importance of context, situations, and so forth. So, oops. Okay, so although the importance of situations, gestalts, etc., contextual wholes should be obvious, there's a long history of research using snapshots with exaggerated expressions cut off from context and cut off from environments. And so a lot of researchers adopt methods that assume otherwise. So these are some examples of Ekman, who I really don't like. I mean, I have nothing against him as a human being, but his research really irritates me. Combined with the insistence of ranking researchers such as Noel Carroll and Paul Ekman, where they say that emotional expression is only slightly underdetermined by faces alone, I think this really distracts from the importance of situations. So without denying that perceived emotional expressions are sometimes signs of what we're feeling, I will argue that perceiving expression is critical in order to register overall situations in order to deal with them. And emotion, of course, very obviously connects to action. So it connects to withdrawing, pausing, advancing, engaging, seeking shelter, when threatened or sad, etc. And I'll argue that something comparable holds for expressions. And this is pretty obvious insofar as a friendly look, like an extended hand, are openings for engagements where I think the picture might be cut off, but Donald Trump's famous picture with Merkel, that's obviously a closure. Okay, so as such, expressions may be helpfully understood in terms of what Gibson calls affordances. I wouldn't want to push this too far because I don't want to get into Gibson's realism and so forth, but roughly speaking, we can kind of understand them in terms of affordances. This is, of course, pushing Gibson's original intent a little bit. So I'll kind of casually explore expression as a subcategory of environmental affordances without pushing it too far, and without pushing it as far as I put it in the paper that I published. If I could go back, I would rework some of that, but such is life. And I will argue that perceiving emotions is, well, it's sometimes about reading minds. It's more directly about reading situations in order to deal with them. The mind reading stuff, I think, is mostly secondary. So I'll be arguing that. Now, of course, a lot of what I'm saying is not entirely new. but there's some interesting consequences. So first, the position suggests taking contextual wholes and not parts as starting points. Now, I think probably for most of this crew, that's a familiar position, and it's one reiterated by Gibson, Gestalt theorist, phenomenologist, pragmatist, I would argue an activist too, so that should be a pretty comfortable position for most of you. But I will argue that if one accordingly recognizes situations as primary, then Coules-Choff effects need not be illusions. Okay, so typically people would say that it's an illusion. I emphatically believe it's not. And again, I'm defining illusion non-controversially as a incorrectly perceived situation. So Coules-Choff effects may instead be understood as Gestalt-like products that increase sensitivity to what's occurring in your environment, and thereby they can facilitate action. A second point I will argue is that Coules-Choff-like scenarios can be regarded as instances of more general cases in which emotions emerge as reflections of interrelationships. Thus, what might otherwise appear as a peaceful landscape, for example, may become ominous when you have threatening clouds around. Angry cloudscapes, likewise, may be serene if combined with particular vistas. So landscapes can operate in a similar way as Coules-Choff effect. Interrelationships and situations include the organism, obviously, so that a farmer, seeing approaching rain with hope, and a lawyer may see it with dreariness. Okay, but again, this is because they live in worlds that have overlapping but still different objective needs. So I'm going to be defending the objectivity, basically, of emotional perception. And so this suggests that environments like faces have what Heinz Werner called physiognomic qualities, that is, expressive features that manifest according to interrelated wholes. Now, the situational account I advance is more radical than some, albeit in line with, for example, Kurt Kafka, in that it holds that we sense emotions in environments, or we can sense emotions in environment without, feeling them. So we can perceive a gloomy landscape when cheerful. We do it all the time. Relatedly, situations and not intersubjectivity are central to experience of emotional expression. And again, this is demonstrated, once again, with a gloomy landscape. You can perceive it when there's not people around. So like in past instantiations of this paper, people would always object, like, if I talked about like the cheerfulness of a Christmas party that you can experience even if you're not feeling happy, they would say, well, you're just perceiving the emotions of the people. But I mean, clearly we can see this in landscapes without people. So that's a point I'll be defending. However, I'll also go further than Kafka by arguing that I won't merely argue that perception is emotionally infused, but I will argue that expressive qualities are, in situations, ontologically speaking, and that they have roughly the same ontological status or amount of reality as action guiding attributes such as affordances. And taken together, my arguments are: one, that perception is expressively charged; two, that expressive qualities are consequences of ecological relationships; and three, that they are accordingly in the world and not just in our heads. Okay, so let's start by talking about the Coules-Choff effect. So in The Art of Cinema, Lev Coules-Choff recollected a portrait in which he saw Lenin smiling. And those of you who know anything about Lenin know that he doesn't really smile that much. And Coules-Choff noted this. He said in the familiar portrait that Lenin actually wasn't smiling, but Coules-Choff added that the spot in the film was so uproariously funny and so forth that he himself, even scrutinizing it several times, saw Lenin smiling. And Coules-Choff went on to say that the montage, what was that people involuntarily imbued, a serious face with a cheerful expression in that playful moment. And he concluded that montage can alter the appearance of expression. And Coules-Choff, in company with the famous filmmaker and theorist Podubkin, later supposedly, some people say it's apocryphal, but Podubkin says they conducted tests, I'll take them at his word, in which they paired shots of an actor with an impassive face in different contexts and different expressions once again showed up. So Merleau-Ponty actually talks about this too, but this is from Podubkin. So Podubkin recounted cutting close-ups of the actor Mostjukin and Mostjukin had an impassive face, but he cut it to a woman in a coffin, to a bowl of soup, and to a girl with a teddy bear. And though the camera recorded Musjukin looking straight ahead, audiences saw him as looking at the woman, the teddy bear, and the soup. Okay, but moreover, they reported that he wore a sorrowful expression, pensive stare, and a warm, a warm look for the soup girl and woman, respectively. I confused the word there. Part of my slides are partly blocked, so I'm shooting in the dark a little bit. But in any case, this highlights, basically the Gestalt principle that, the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I mean, in cinema, this is the case. And so it's kind of an illustration also of Gestalt principles. Okay, so the Kuleshov experiment, as originally described, was pretty simple. And when with richer juxtapositions, you can increase its power considerably. And so some experiments, in this case, conducted informally with discussion groups, I looked at, focused on non-primates, and of course, animals occasionally, have features that resemble emotions, as with Grumpy Cat or a Basset Hound. And there's an aesthetic theory called contour theory, a resemblance theories. And I'm not rejecting them. I'm just saying much of the time there's quite a bit more going on. So occasionally this occurs, but these cases really aren't typical. And I would say more often when you perceive, say emotion on your cat, when it's in front of a full bull looking up at you with hopeful eyes, it's a consequence of the overall context. And it typically is an action producing context, which may, provoke you to, give your cat some food. Also notice that we can have Kuleshov-like effects with audio phenomena. So, if you hear your cat mewing in front of a bull, you'll hear that as being imploring and so forth, okay? And there's cinematic examples of this. So one example I use comes from Tchaikovsky's Nostalgia, but it's a famous scene with a dog where a guy lights himself on fire, but the emotional expression shows up in the dog in this overall context. Okay, but I looked at some other examples. So I also looked at some examples from Star Wars, and some of them were with edited clips, some of them were with non-edited. So there's a famous non-edited clip in Return of the Jedi. I don't know how many of you know it, but where the evil Empire is shooting lightning at Luke Skywalker, and he's screaming, "Father, Father, help me!" And Darth Vader, his mask really seems to express quite a bit of emotional expression. So I did tests. I got a very strong effect where 93% and like a super small p-value. Reported negative emotion on Darth Vader's face and in his eyes. So that was unexpectedly strong. And a second one, there's a re-edited clip, and rather than talking about the clip, I will show it to you. I'll have to, I guess, stop this share and start another share. Okay, so screen share, and okay, so I'm gonna just show you the clip. And okay, so let's see, how do I do this? Okay, yeah, so I hope you can all see it. It's probably not going to come out very clearly, so you're probably going to have to impute the effect, but the effect when you show this in a room blowing up is, again, very strong.
What is it, General? My lord, the fleet has moved out at light speed. Comscan has detected an energy field. Comscan has detected an energy field protecting it.
In the shot here, people tend to see sarcasm. I don't know whether it shows up for you.
Comscan has detected it.
But anyway, so that's one example. And although the next one comes later, I'll maybe just try to show it to you now while I have the screen share set up, if I can figure out how to get out of this. So escape. Sorry. Okay. So I'm just going to share the second one while I have the screen share set up. So the second one is Hitchcock. And obviously when I show this, I cut out the sound so they don't hear Hitchcock's narration, but this effect is super strong. I've never actually encountered a person who doesn't experience the effect. Again, I don't know whether it'll be distorted because I'm showing this through Zoom. Let's just watch.
Let me show what he sees. Let's assume he saw a woman holding a baby in her arms. Now we cut back to his reaction to what he sees, and he smiles. Now, what is he as a character? He's a kindly man. He's sympathetic. Now, let's take the middle piece of film away, the woman with the child, but leave his two pieces of film as they were. Now we'll put in a piece of film of a girl in a bikini. He looks, girl in a bikini, he smiles. What is he now? The dirty old man. He's no longer the benign gentleman who loves babies. That's the difference. That's what film can do for you.
Or you for it as a
Okay, so go back to screen share. Okay, so like the strength of these effects actually surprised me, like you know, especially because like if you're trying to like classify things, like say if it's like you know, with a lot of the scenarios, like when it's on a kind of a forced choice, with forced choice options, there's a lot of things that overlap. When I've done this in discussion groups, and I've done this cross-culturally on multiple continents, the effect seems to be even stronger. But anyways, so in the Vader case, a lot of people see sarcasm on Vader's face in the re-edited sequence. In the original sequence, they see fear on the officer's face. In the re-edited one, they tend to see confusion, which makes sense. And in the Hitchcock case, pretty much everybody sees, you know, like 94% of people report seeing a dirty smile in the second instance. So these are pretty strong examples that show the effect of context on emotion perception. So summarizing views that Hitchcock expressed to Francis Truffaut, who's actually a famous French filmmaker and theorist. I presume some of you know that, but maybe not all of you, I don't know. A psychologist named H.B. Walbot writes that filmmakers can create contextual information using editing techniques which guide the viewer to infer certain attitudes or emotions not immediately evident in the actor's expressive behavior itself. And although I would grant, sure, this sometimes goes on, I think this is an intellectualization of what's occurring. Because I don't think any of us are really inferring. I think we see the emotion immediately. I think Hitchcock's smile looks different, and it unequivocally looks different. And I think something comparable occurs in the Vader example. So consequently, emotional expression, I would argue, is immediately evident in Hitchcock's face, and for most people also in Vader's too. And this suggests that context, it doesn't merely change what we infer, it changes what we see. Okay, next section. So since the 1960s, prominent psychologists have argued that there are basic emotions, each having a universal corresponding facial expression. And almost using like British empiricist language, defenders suggest that you can break expressions into what they call discrete action units, and that action units can build up into more complicated molecular expressions. So it's very much kind of in the British empiricist sort of tradition, the way they're talking. And they also mechanistically assert that basic expressions involve, you can't fake them. It's basically kind of a, you know, a hardwired reaction. And again, I'm not disputing that this goes on to a degree, okay? And Paul Ekman, of course, is the most famous proponent of this, and he's marketed it aggressively. And when I say marketed, he's made a shit ton of money marketing it. And he gets very, very touchy if anybody challenges. You'll see this in print, but also my co-author, when he's like a graduate student, he wasn't really even criticizing Ekman, but he was called into Ekman's office to have like a dressing down. So like, I mean, he's done a lot of good research, but you know, he's also made a lot of money, you know, marketing this to the security industry and so forth. Now, some critics charge that the research methods employed, which funnel responses into a limited number of options, bias results towards identifying a small number of basic emotions and expressions, but also when you look at the examples he uses, it's the most like exaggerated, you know, facial expression that you can find that you very rarely encounter in the world. And recent research further suggests, and this is published in, I think, either Science or Nature, so like in a, you know, top scientific journal, but it suggests that his you know, deception detection techniques are as good as a random coin toss. Okay, so in Gestalt psychology, pragmatic philosophy, and phenomenology, you know, which all influenced Gibson, of course, suggest an explanation as to why, and the explanation should be obvious, and that's that contextual wholes precede and indeed alter how isolated parts show up, and the Kuleshov effect strongly illustrates this. Okay, so in the case of Hitchcock and Vader, I mean, so Ekman would say you're not in charge of what your face expresses. And of course, Hitchcock and Vader aren't in charge of what their faces express, but that's because you're re-editing film clips and Hitchcock's wearing a mask. Okay, so I grant they're not in charge of what they express, but it's not because their facial muscles are involuntarily jerking. And although this sometimes happens in everyday life, of course, it does not occur here since in the Hitchcock case, that the same pieces of film are used and Vader, it's the same film in Vader too, but he's also wearing a mask. Okay, so one might want to regard Kuleshov effects as illusions. I think this is inaccurate for a number of reasons. So first, perceiving expression is foremost about reading situations in order to deal with them, as opposed to reading minds per se. And Gibson sort of got at this a little bit when he remarked, he makes a lot of nice remarks like this, but one of his remarks is that a cliff edge affords falling, it looks dangerous, and it is dangerous. Okay, and without getting around to imputing intentionality in Hitchcock's smile, for example, when he's looking at the woman in the bikini, it's comparable. His smile looks predatory. And in everyday life, it might be so. And if you have like you're there with your 14-year-old daughter, your vigilance might go up, and maybe you would try to get your daughter out of that situation. Okay, and the situation with Vader is similar, and this would even be if he's like a mindless robot, but it would be an angry making situation that would provoke attacking, fleeing, maybe staying passive out of fear or whatever. Okay, but again, you're reading the situation, I think, in an accurate way when you're perceiving these emotional expressions. Okay, so again, understood in this way, expressions showing up in Kuleshov-like scenarios, we can see them as markers of what's occurring in situations, and sometimes they might also indicate what's occurring in minds, but I don't even really think that's of central importance. Okay, so second reason that I don't think the Kuleshov effect is an illusion is that the word illusion suggests that we're misperceiving situations. Yet again, if you encountered, a Hitchcock-like situation in the world, I think many people would likely think that you're registering the smiles differently, with some notable exceptions to be discussed, be an example of perceiving, the situations in a fairly accurate and meaningful way. And experimental findings, in fact, suggest that there's all sorts of experiments like this, but there's some experiments where they just, they'll show you a picture of a wide-eyed man, in the wee hours of night, okay, and then, they'll tell you that, and basically most people can figure out he's experiencing some kind of emotional arousal, but without grasping what kind. But when people are told that he's just gotten a letter reporting a death, they'll interpret it as being grief. When they say he's just gotten an insulting letter, they'll report it as being anger. And this raises a question. So if context moderates how we perceive expressions, can we claim that we're perceiving things accurately? So suppose, again, we perceive the lascivious leer of an old man gazing at a bikini-clad girl. And I'm going to say girl, like I'm going to make it more dirty, like a 13 or 14-year-old or something. Okay, but and I think a lot of us would be a bit put off by that. And then later we learn that he's her grandfather, so he's just happy to see her. Okay, and thereby we come to see his smile more charitably. Okay, but again, notice here, the more context you have, the more accurately you perceive things. So the context is not deceiving you. The more context you have, the more fully you perceive it. So the context in this case actually helps you get rid of a misperception as opposed to inflicting a misperception. So reinforcing this, there's psychologists who've done experiments that show that we're unable to distinguish faces expressing intensely positive experiences from negative ones, for instance, sporting victories or defeats or orgasms versus nipple piercings, when you have faces isolated from bodies. But they also find that, say, if you put the head of a victorious tennis player on the body of a defeated tennis player, that most people will actually perceive the overall expression as being defeated and not victorious. Okay, and so this really kind of undermines the notion that faces are the primary conveyor of emotion, given if you put a defeated face on a victorious tennis player, people will see the expression as being victorious. And again, the Hitchcock and Vader examples reinforce these conclusions, but they extend these conclusions too to include the overall environment. Okay, so a third point, the word illusion suggests that we're perceiving that it suggests, or I can't quite see my slides, it suggests perception of something not physically received by the senses and hence not actually there. Okay, but what I would like to note is that perceiving what is not received by the senses a lot of times actually means perceiving qualities that precisely are there. So color constancy is an example of this. So if you see a white tablecloth bathed in yellow candlelight, you'll see the tablecloth as being white and not yellow, even though your eye is primarily receiving yellow wavelengths. Okay, and the only time you would typically see the white tablecloth as being yellow is once again if you isolate it from the context, if you're looking at a little hole where the overall context is cut off, but you're just getting a little patch of white. In that case, if it's bathed in yellow, you might perceive it as being yellow. Okay, but what I want you to notice here is that I mean, leaving philosophical arguments aside about color being a secondary property, which I reject, and maybe I'll get into that a little bit later. But for just talking in everyday terms, most people would say if you perceive the tablecloth as being white, you're perceiving it accurately. If you're perceiving it as being yellow, something's off. Okay, and Hitchcock's smile is different. Is the same. So again, in the case of Hitchcock, we perceive what would be absent from the face in isolation. Okay, but when we have it in the overall context, a different expression shows up, just as in the case of color constancy. And you can make the strong case that in the everyday world, you would actually be registering it more accurately because of the context. Okay, so covered this. Okay, so, and again, of course, like when we're talking about, varying expressions showing up, of course, this all implies there's an observer, in the interrelationship. Okay, but again, this is the same with color. And again, most people, except for philosophers, don't reject, it as an illusion if you perceive a white tablecloth as being white. And I would also note more generally that relational accounts of properties are remarkably robust. Okay, so this is insofar as color, length, mass, understood as resistance to acceleration, time, they all vary with relative velocity. Okay, and particles likely show up by virtue of one hitting another, so it's kind of a relational sort of thing. There's further things like you can set up an apparatus to detect waves and then light will show up as a wave, whereas you've set it up to detect particles, it will show up as a particle. Okay, so again, like the notion that properties are relational, this shouldn't be a foreign idea because you can come up with some that aren't, like maybe like the number of molecules in a cup, like maybe that's not relational. Okay, but most properties are relational. So I would just have you note this. Okay, and the Coolstroff-like scenarios fit this template, which is once again to say they're products of an interrelated whole and that they vary according to the interrelated whole. Okay, and this is an alternative to rejecting the Coolstroff-like scenario as an illusion. Okay, okay, and again, so like speaking in pragmatic terms or gestalt terms or phenomenological terms, we can say that situations are ontologically primary. They're where things and events with specifiable properties initially and actually show up. And on these grounds, I would argue that contextually modulated expressions, they're products of relationships in our world and that they're not illusions. Okay, so next section. So quoting from Kafka, and I mean, Gibson did this in an attempt to differentiate himself. But Gibson, he talked about demand characters, which is a notion. I think I might have this wrong. I think they actually took that from Kurt Lewin and not Werner. But anyways, but when Gibson's describing demand characters, he says each thing says what it is. Fruit says eat me. Water says drink me. Thunder says fear me. And he's Kafka's talking in the passive gendered language. He says woman says love me, so we can object to that if you want, but he says these values are vivid and essential in experience. He says the post box invites mailing, the mailing of a letter, the handle wants to be grasped, the things tell us what to do with them, hence they have what, and it's cut out, I think it's what Lewin called demand characters and not Werner. But a second idea discussed by Gestalt psychologist that Gibson also talks about, and this is Werner, is what Werner called physiognomic qualities. Okay, and when we talk about physiognomic qualities, we're typically talking about facial expressions. But Werner, expressly argued that we see physiognomic properties in environments. And so my view, I think, extends these views, because what I'm going to try to argue is that we read facial expressions like environmental spaces. So the standard argument is that we read environments like faces, and maybe that's true to a point, but I actually think we also read faces the same way we read environments. So that's going to be one of my arguments. Okay, so although physiognomic qualities differ from demand characters in that demand characters are meant to be linked to temporary needs. So if I really need coffee, as I do right now, maybe the coffee cup will have a demand character. Physiognomic qualities are kind of meant to be more independent of the particular emotional state that you're in. And we see this because if I see you're being sad, okay, and if I'm just happy and I'm just happy even though you're sad, I can still see that you're sad without necessarily experiencing your sadness. Okay, so because of this, physiognomic qualities parallel affordances to some extent, because affordances again are also meant to remain independent of current interests, needs, emotional states, and so forth. And affordances are meant to remain in the environment whether you notice them or not. Okay, and so this is a reason why Gibson insists that affordances, well, to put it simply, he says they're objective, but it gets a little more complicated than that. But we don't need to go into that. Okay, and so demand characters are similar in this way, and demand characters also they're clearly valuative in nature. So if you're seeing emotional expressions, whether it's in an environment or a face, you're seeing values. And of course, Gibson's term affordances, he simply says it's a substitute for values. Okay, so he says when I'm talking about affordances, I'm talking about values, and so this is another parallel, which Gibson, of course, acknowledges. So elaborating on his own views, Gibson urged that the perceptual field of the world, it's not value free. We don't superimpose values on it. He says, when we're perceiving, we perceive value-rich ecological objects. He says any substance, any layout, any object has any affordance, has he says it has an affordance for benefit or injury to somebody. Okay, so thus while suggesting differences between affordances and demand characters, Gibson acknowledges that affordances relate to your biological situation, okay, and our biological situation, of course, relates to emotions and so forth that we may feel, okay, and I would argue this brings Gibson pretty close to William James, and Gibson acknowledges this at the beginning of his last book. Okay, so James's view also has an externalist bent, since pragmatists also stress, like with people like Merleau-Ponty, that needs and desires only have emotions in the world. So in a lovely passage, Merleau-Ponty says stuff like, if you try to reduce emotions to inner states, there's nothing left. You get like a few pangs and tremors, but in order for the emotion to have meaning, in order for it to be an emotion, it has to be situated in the world. And James also advanced views like this. So again, our waking attitude is nearly always one of wanting to do something, get something, avoid something. In other words, it's a situation of concerned interest. And to use an example that James offered, he says a mechanic values oil as a lubricant, like emotionally values oil as a lubricant. A carpenter emotionally values it as a wood darkener, so that oil shows up to them differently. Okay, now at the same time, there's nothing subjective in this, because oil continues to be a lubricant and a wood darker irrespective of desires, just as affordances remain, irrespective of whether we're interested in exploiting them. And it's worth adding too that oily properties are also relational, like other ones we've talked about. So if I have oil, sliding between my hands, it's clearly a relational property. Okay, now valuative notions of environmental perception reoccur in the work of Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, who I like very much. Now, among environmental psychologists, they're well known. Outside that field, I think not so much these days. But they built somewhat on Gibson. Okay, but they specifically propose that aesthetic experience reflects rapid and pre-reflective appraisals of what's afforded in a setting. And they actually compare it to social perception. So they're like, you can meet somebody and judge at an instant, like maybe the appropriate emotional response. You can read the emotions in a room very quickly. And they suggest that we can read, non-human environments in this way too. And one repeatedly confirmed finding is that people, for example, if they have a choice, they like settings with a trail disappearing around a corner. So by virtue of having a trail, you have some legibility, okay? So you can find your way out, but by virtue of disappearing around a corner, it has mystery, and you kind of feel pulled in. And we all have that experience. We have this experience in city too, like in interesting city alleys, that experience of kind of being pulled in, but they characterize this as mystery. And it's an allure that arises from things partly hidden or unclear, you know, the promise of something new, and it solicits deeper penetration. Okay, now this illustration, in fact, exemplifies physiognomic characters and by extension Kuleshov scenarios. Okay, so to begin with, Werner said that qualities are, can't quite read it. Oh yeah, like I can't quite read the passage, but he basically says, like, when you experience like mystery, you're not, it's not something you're experiencing in you, it's something that you're perceiving in the world. Okay, and the Kaplans are arguing this. Okay, and so while mystery might emotionally attract us, you know, it's something that we observe in the world. Okay, and we can observe it in the physical environment, but notice we could also observe it in an, you know, in an enigmatic smile, for example. Okay, a second parallel is the relational underpinnings of all of this, you know, the grounding and contextual wholes and so forth. So notice that it's rarely a smile alone that makes for mysteriousness, but a total setting, which, you know, in the case of James Bond, might include, you know, a tuxedo-clad man with a cigarette dangling out of his hand, nonchalantly hovering over a bar with, you know, jazz pattering in the background. But it's the entire situation that maybe makes the smile mysterious and captivating. And likewise with winding trails. Okay, it's not the trails alone don't heighten mystery by themselves, but the quality is one that emerges when you combine elements such as navigability with things that are disappearing out of view. Okay, so, and likewise with other environmental physiognomic qualities. So you have like a seascape might be tranquil or grim depending on the clouds that it's with. So again, it has to do with the relationship between everything in the scene. Okay, now all of this fits with the thesis that while perceiving emotional expression is that it's sorry, I can't read this. Oh, well, I guess I'm going to say, well, like so I'll grant that, you know, perceiving emotional expression may sometimes be about, you know, registering outward signs of inner states, but what I want to argue is it's more squarely about perceiving situations. Okay, so this is such that we have an immediate sense, for example, of obstacles and openings and how we might negotiate them. This is obviously the case in environmental settings such as those described by the Kaplans, but it's also the case with facial expressions. So like affordances, facial and environmental physiognomic qualities, they remain independently of whether we're, you know, pulled to them or not, okay, or whether we're neutral. Okay, so again, you can see somebody who's sad and want to help them, or you can feel somebody who's sad and be indifferent, but you'll register it in the same way. And you can be in a gloomy landscape and be happy, or you can be in a gloomy landscape and be sad. Okay, thus with an old man leering at a bikini-clad teenager, the dirty smile, you know, we see the dirty smile whether we're the object or not. I don't think any of us felt threatened by Hitchcock, but it's something we could see, you know, whether we're the object of it or not, whether we feel threatened by it or not. And this is just as one, I would say, sees hope shining in the eyes of a cat next to a bowl, even if they're a prick and they don't want to feed the cat. And we can likewise see mysteriousness in settings or, you know, smiles, regardless of whether we're inclined to explore the other human being or the environment. So expressions on faces then compare to emotional qualities and environments, but not necessarily because the latter approximates the former as resemblance and contour theories posit. So I of course, like resemblance theories and contour theories are sometimes true. Like grumpy cat looks grumpy because he resembles a grumpy face, or I actually don't really find weeping willows look sad, but assuming they do, they look sad because they resemble demoralized bodies. So I'm not disputing that this sometimes occurs. But what I'm arguing is that we more often read faces like environmental affordances. You know, so you might read you know, you could read a hostile expression as one that closes further engagement, or a friendly expression as one that might open it up. And again, all of this is modulated by context. Mysterious smiles and settings likewise can be understood in terms of affordances because both suggest something hidden and thereby inviting approach, exploration, and deeper penetration. Okay, so the overall picture advanced so far supports the view that situations are epistemologically and ontologically primary. That is to repeat where observable and hence knowable properties first show up. And this makes emotional qualities perceived in situations not so different from properties registered through traditional sensory modalities. Not only does this challenge the idea that emotional perception is wholly subjective, but it also counters the notion that it necessarily arises through sensing what other people are feeling, and that we must feel these emotional qualities to perceive. And it's amazing how common this view is. So Kafka and Dewey, reiterated this. I've already talked about this, but like we can be in a gloomy landscape when we're cheerful. Dewey says similar stuff. Dreyfus talks about, Dreyfus says we talk about emotions being in us, but we oftentimes find ourselves in an emotional mood. So here's a cozy Christmas scene. I take it you all would perceive that as cozy and happy, even if you're depressed, okay? But we see it immediately, okay? There's no dispute here, I don't think. Okay, and the idea also gets repeated by people like Nico Frijda. I won't read the quote because you're probably familiar with it, and because I might be running out of time, and Jan Slavy and Joel Kruger. So a variety of people kind of repeat the basic idea. Okay, but notice once more that similarly to perceiving color, we can perceive emotional qualities without becoming them. So as when we sense merriment at a Christmas party when we're depressed. Okay, and art is similar. Okay, so while people like Jesse Prince have expressed awe about how good composers, can send listeners into an abyss with a D minor chord, the more remarkable thing that people typically neglect is that we can hear exultation in Beethoven's Ode to Joy even when we're depressed, and we can hear anguish in Pergolesi's Stabat Mater when we're happy. I think that's the more remarkable thing. Okay, and this suggests once again that we can sense emotions in the world without having them. And this in turn reinforces the claim that emotional qualities are not in us, but they're in overall context once again. Okay, and Dewey's ideas about perception and especially art further reinforce this outlook. So anticipating Dewey and Merleau-Ponty, I take it you probably know Dewey, but Dewey and Merleau-Ponty are like this. They're like, brothers from another mother, to use the expression. I wish they'd read one another because the similarities are really remarkable. Okay, but anticipating Merleau-Ponty and an activist, Dewey urged that subject and object are built up in one of the same continuing operation. Okay, so like when I caress my hands, I have smoothness, basically subject object built up in one of the same operation, anticipating Gibson too. And then Dewey added in a mix of rationalist and empiricist language that perception is the act of the going out in order to receive. Okay, so thus when my hands caress this cup, smoothness is realized as a perceptual effect. Now, Dewey's understanding of art proceeded similarly. So he said it's not a photograph or a painting that produces certain aesthetic effects in us. He said rather that the picture itself is a total effect brought about by an interaction of what he calls external. He'll call some organic and extra-organic things. I can't actually read the passage, so I'm sort of shooting in the dark again. But he says it's a total effect. So just as smoothness is a total effect, he says when you perceive a painting aesthetically, it's a total effect. Okay, so this means that the picture exists for entities having capacities to see it as such, and its beauty, which in being in being an intrinsic part of the total effect, belongs to the picture just as much as the rest of the properties do. So Dewey would actually say that beauty is there just as much as anything else you're seeing in the painting, okay, because it's all an outcome of a total interaction. And so recognizing the emotionality of aesthetic characteristics, an art critic might describe an Ansel Adams photograph as having emotionally turbulent clouds. And for reasons just mentioned, might conclude that these emotional attributes as parts of the total effect are no less objective than the picture itself. And I would agree with this. I don't know whether you will. And if we encounter a serene mountainscape and turbulent clouds in person, we might say the same still. And this is echoed also by more recent phenomenologists such as Baume. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Okay, so while emotions help us navigate social worlds, I mean, of course they do, there's worlds beyond this with which they obviously help. Our dealings with nearly everything involve likings, dislikings, preferences, which are both emotional and aesthetic in nature. Aesthetics and by extension, emotional perception relates to what we feel capable of doing, or not what we feel, what we are capable of doing. And this gets additional support from experiments, which I suspect many of you are familiar with, that finds that participants, things will look further away, steeper when wearing heavy backpacks, fatigued, in poor health, or sad. So if you're sad, that's probably going to reduce your energy levels too. But anything that basically lowers your energy levels will increase perceived distance. Okay, and perceived distance typically is registered with emotional deflation. And like the aesthetic preferences just mentioned, it relates to the ease or difficulty with which one can navigate one's body. In other words, the situation in which one finds oneself. Standard interpretations would take this as evidence of, they would say this demonstrates the non-vertical nature of perception. However, I think, and a lot of other people think too, that it very obviously demonstrates that you're seeing things accurately because you're perceiving, basically, you're registering the difficulty with which, like how difficult it will be for you to get to this location or that location, given your current capacities. Okay, so hence, let's look at some other examples. So hence, when suffering, bereavement, the world becomes more strenuous and burdensome. I mean, it might be harder to get out of bed in the morning, harder to get to your tasks than it was before the death. And so you come to inhabit a different emotional world. And farmers and lawyers, for example, may also inhabit different emotional worlds. So that a lawyer may see rain with despondency, whereas a farmer suffering drought may see it with hope. Okay, and but I want to point out that just because we live in worlds that, I mean, they overlap mostly because we're all human beings with similar bodies and similar needs. And that's why I think we actually can understand one another, and we don't have to, be from identical cultures and so forth to have an understanding. But to the extent that we experience things differently, it's typically because we have to act differently. Okay, and so again, a lawyer and a farmer, they have different kind of objective needs. Or we could look at, cats versus humans. So it's not a mere mental variation that differentiates a cat's experience of lapping milk well on all fours versus your experience of sipping it through a straw. This is a difference in action, and different actions realize different experiences. Okay, so the emotional world of the farmer, the lawyer, the grieving person, they differ because they have objectively different needs pulling and pushing them in different ways. They accordingly experience differently because they act differently. Yet their worlds also overlap to a significant extent because common experience arises out of being pushed and pulled. Similarly, for example, facing common threats, common fears, and accordingly needing to do similar things. So we're at the conclusion. Okay, so I probably rushed too much, I apologize. So I began this presentation by considering the Cool's-Chop effect and how sorry, I can't see anymore. How Cool's-Chop and how, sorry, my notes are cut off. I considering the Cool's-Chop effect and how I'm just going to say how situations alter emotional expressions. I then generalized, arguing that situations are emotionally laden, and that we would struggle to function if they weren't. Okay, and so I will review what has been affirmed. So okay, so one point is that the world is emotionally laden, and I just said this, and we would struggle to function if we're not. So I'm very tired when I was putting these notes together, and I think basically everybody accepts some variation of this. I don't think I'm being radically original here, but what I would point out is commentators typically focus on disgust and rage and so forth when discussing how emotions help us function in the world. And relatively few discuss stuff like mystery. Okay, and also when talking about, our tendency to perceive let's say the non-human environment in emotional ways, the standard account is that we do this because we're perceiving this as a byproduct of social perception, so that we're used to perceiving humans in emotional ways, and we see a weeping willow that looks sad, so we conclude that a weeping willow is sad. And I would argue that not too many people recognize the reverse to be true, that to repeat an example I've already given, a mysterious smile may be like a mysterious environment, not to mention a mysterious artwork, and that all promise something worthwhile while not revealing too much, therewith pulling us into them. Another lesson is that false impressions of situations lead, so if you misconceive the situation, you're likely to misperceive the emotional expression. This is like color constancy too. And so, as I just said, the same holds elsewhere. For example, with color constancy, also holds with ideas. If I say my ring is in the garbage, if your question was, where's your engagement ring, it means something very serious. If your question is, where's that cheap piece of novelty plastic junk you found on the sidewalk, means something differently. So if I contextualize the idea differently, it means something very different. Okay, so the Kuleshov effect and perception of emotional expression reiterate these ideas. So the Kuleshov effect, so none of this means that, I'm not disputing that faces convey a lot of information. Of course they convey a lot of information. But very often they do so in reaction to situations. If you subtract the situation, then you have trouble really kind of interpreting the face. Moreover, as the Kuleshov effect demonstrates, along lines of studies showing that people cannot differentiate between orgasmic ecstasy and the agony of a nipple piercing. So if you can guess which this is, I find that people's guess depends on the culture. I even will anticipate which one you're going to guess. We'll see though. But again, I don't think most of you would want to bet your house on it. But so when faces are isolated, people have a difficult time determining like whether this woman is experiencing pleasure or pain. This again suggests that situations are primary. Okay, and that reading emotion is about reading situations and not just minds fits also with an evolutionary picture in which advanced cognition and therefore knowledge of other minds is a fairly recent development, and where at the end of the day, it's more important to see a situation like say with a rampaging lion, or say if I'm a rampaging person, to see it as being fearsome and hence dangerous, rather than taking time to impute like, what is Matthew Crippen thinking? You know, does he want to kill me? Like, no, you just see me as being dangerous if I look dangerous. That's, you know, so that even we're in an evolutionary situation where like knowledge of other minds, it's probably a fairly recent phenomena. I'm sorry to have included this picture. I couldn't resist. But the same goes, you know, for a you know, bikini clad man glaring at teenagers who we might see as predatory. And since faces and other objects of emotion are encountered over and against situations, not against situations, but in them, faces can also change how we encounter a situation. So a fan smiling and cheering at a hard-earned goal makes for a very different situation than you know, fans staring in shocked silence at the same event. And taken together, I hope all of this stands as yet another repudiation of the view that our world is, it's cut out again, but is built up out of basic units. Okay, and this is a thesis that's been maintained by behavioralists, empiricists, and more recently, you know, in more recent work on emotion perception by people like Ekman, and which, you know, people like Merleau-Ponty, Gestalt theorists, pragmatists, and, you know, I would argue more recent, like embodied people like an activist, all have tried to counter. And that's it. Thank you very much. Try to kill my stop share. Okay. Sorry, that was a whirlwind. I apologize. It was like I'm kind of frantic right now. I have so much caffeine and stuff in my system. So
thank you, Matthew. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think now we can begin with our comments, and afterwards everybody's invited to ask questions. But first, I'll be chairing the session, but I'll chair myself now. I'll be the first one to ask something for you. Well, at first, I think this is very enlightening and very interesting. I think you offer a very persuasive argument for the idea that situations are primary in emotional perception. I think this is on point, and it's an important contribution to the research program on ecological psychology. And so I will focus on something that is, I think, a minor point of your paper, and it appeared here and there on your presentation, but I think it seems to me you may have left open, but I'm not sure, a very interesting possibility that we can explore, but I want to hear more from you about that. So what I have in mind is that you refrain from saying that perceiving expressions is about reading minds per se. In your paper, this is in page 8. It has appeared in your presentation a couple of times.
Yeah.
And this is something you return to in page 16 of your paper, when you claim that reading emotion is about reading situations and not just minds. And I believe the reason for this hesitation is that one can perceive a situation or expression, even in the case of a putative mindless robot. It would follow that perceiving situations can't be about mind reading, if you're talking about a mindless robot, of course.
Yeah.
But I would argue that if a supposedly mindless robot behaves in a certain way that is sufficiently convincing so that we perceive the situations by observing its behaviors, then I think it's more plausible to ascribe some level of mentality to it. I don't know if I'm being too liberal with ascribing mentality to stuff, but I'm generally okay with that. So it follows that perceiving emotions and situations would actually be about mind reading. But the key here is to conceive of mind reading not as accessing the snapshots of someone's mind. I think you mentioned somewhere about inner events or something like that. I think we should have a more externalist or Gibsonian notion of mind reading, in the sense that I'm not saying that mind reading is about knowing that a person is entertaining a certain thought. Instead, I think we should reconceive mind reading as engaging with a person in a certain way, in certain ways, by perceiving the solicitations and prohibitions afforded by their behavior. So instead of talking about the access, the propositional access to someone else's mind, or the snapshot view of their inner mental states, I think this would mean having the practical knowledge to respond appropriately to their actions. So of course, we're gonna need to have a something that precludes us from saying that environments have minds, of course. So this is something we also would have to work on this hypothesis. But assuming that we're talking about agents and given their behavior, I think I'm willing to go to this line of perceiving expressions and situations as having the practical knowledge to respond appropriately to their actions. I'm willing to follow this path from your argument, but I see you have stopped right there, I think, at a certain point.
No, I think your point is excellent. So I think, like, from day one, even before I was doing philosophy of mind, I've always sort of been in an embodied framework, where I was even surprised once I started doing philosophy of mind, which is fairly late thing for me, but I was surprised to learn that people even still had this sort of view that you have stimulus and it goes inside your brain, and you have, I was even surprised that this view was still taken seriously. But having said that, I think probably I'm trapped in the culture of that, and I think you point that out nicely. So I think if you are advancing a genuinely embodied view, then yeah, you wouldn't assume that mind is a exclusively interior problem. And so you would basically just say, like, when I'm reading the body language, so when I'm, for example, imputing the fearsomeness of say Matthew Crippen, if I go crazy, that you don't even have to get inside my head to impute that. So I think that's a very good point that's worth expanding. I would also say, like, in recent, I used to be kind of extreme, right? I refused to talk about anything internal. I also didn't believe in causality, so I wouldn't use the word because, which made part writing really difficult. But I would also say, like, we don't need, like, I don't think we need to get too extreme. Like, I think there's a sense in which, we kind of know there's something going on inside a little bit, like, I think, like, as embodied as we might want to be, I don't think we want to dispute, that like, if I'm keeping a secret from you or something like that, I think, so we know that some of that goes on. I think the problem in the history of work of mind is that view is just so overplayed. And but I really like your approach. So maybe that'll be the next paper that we can co-author together or something. But I think it's nicely worded. So I think basically one of the problems you're getting at is, like, as much as I have rejected these older sort of internalistic views, that I'm still inevitably trapped in that language and that way of thinking in terms of how I'm framing things. So I appreciate the remark. Great remark.
Thank you. I would have a follow-up, but since we have a lot of questions in line here, we have Nara and Marco and Andre, and, well, we have also Felipe who make his comments. So maybe I will have this follow-up later on, but thank you for your answer, Matt. That was very, very nice. I can pass my word to Felipe now.
Okay, I have some slides that I'll use, so just share
Okay.
my screen.
It's not showing up, Felipe, so far. I don't know if Felipe is still there though. I think he is stuck. He doesn't move. I can't perceive the situation clearly. Yeah, I think he had some internet problem. So
I think I can read this black screen as he's anxious.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, but he moved a little bit, I think. No, I think yes. Yeah, he's out, but we can return to his comments afterwards. Let's see. I'm opening the chat. Let's see. I think Nara is the first in line. Nara. you can go.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Hi,
Hello, how are you?
Matthew. Many thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Mhm.
And I'm very sympathetic to your view. There are actually a few points that I have suggested myself in a few presentations. I have argued that the Miller Lire is also not an illusion because we see that as a bigger thing, and if it's an antenna, it would fit in a box. The smaller one would fit and the bigger one wouldn't fit. I also suggested recently, I think Eros was in one of a recent talk, that we should work on performance studies as philosophers, because we have a lot of performance theory that we could that could help our thinking on the emergence of meaning and everything. So I really like your approach, and I see that he used performance studies as empirical evidence, but what I have suggested is that we go to performance theory, and I think we have a lot to dialogue with people working on that. So, but there are 2 points. There's one question and one point that I would like to press you on. I'll let the question for later. The point is on the primacy of the situations. As I said, I'm sympathetic to that. I think that in many times, in many cases, we actually arrive in situations. For example, if I arrive at the party and you have the decoration, you have a whole setting that already tells you that the mood is gonna be nice there and these things. So I acknowledge that there is a temporal primacy there, but I'm a little uneasy about an ontological primacy, because in many cases, our actions are as much important as everything else in determining what the situation is. So I would go for a co-determination approach in this sense, because if depending on how I start acting in a certain situation, I'm going to build up I'm going to create a different situation. I'm going to be part on the creation. I'm going to take part on the creation of a situation. So I'd really like to listen your take on that, what you think, and also, and about the relational nature of things. Yeah, I'm totally on board with that. So.
Yeah, I don't think we're disagreeing much. I think maybe we're just operating on different definitions of situation. So I use the term situation. It includes everything, includes human being, surrounding. So like if you have say if you have a woman like in a kitchen with a cat sniffing around her feet, okay, I would say you have more than one situation, because the cat's in one situation and the woman's in another, okay, because the situation includes the woman, her capacities, and so forth, and the cat is kind of in a different situation. So like I'm using situation kind of somewhat close to like Umwelt, so it includes like Umwelt sometimes, I mean, like as an activist use it, they don't mean it in a subjective way, but as originally used, it's more subjective than I would like. But like the situation, like it includes me, this cup, the desk, you, it's sort of just the overall whole. But I would strongly argue again that like you don't, like it's very difficult to come up with anything that shows up outside of relationships, even with like physical properties. So but like I'm willing, but like, you know, the solar system can be a situation. So I'm using it pretty widely, and maybe people could say maybe I'm using it too loosely, because you know, sometimes if you go too broad, it can things can sort of lose their usefulness. But for me, the situation, like, you know, my situation, it includes like everything in my room, my actions, the city, you know, the kind of cultural background I bring into. But I think all these things, they all are defining. And if you start subtracting this stuff down, you'll eventually whittle things down to nothing. So I think basically, I think we're in agreement. I think I'm just using the term in a slightly different way. I think you're muted.
Sorry, Giovanni, should we?
Well,
My second question, but I can leave it for later if.
yeah.
May I ask you a question? It's out of curiosity.
Okay.
The name Nara, is that a Portuguese name?
Nara.
Yeah, well, because like it's a Middle Eastern name too. That's why I'm just curious whether it's got the Middle Eastern influences, or do you happen to know that? I'm just curious.
I don't happen to know that.
know,
it's not a very common name here.
Yeah, I know like Omar and Salma kind of worked their way in, you know, when the Muslims were in Andalusia, and so it's just like, it's not. I just was curious because it's a name I've only ever encountered in the Middle East. That's the reason I was asking. So,
but I know I was named after a Brazilian singer.
Okay.
I was going to comment on that.
So the question is, it's a clarification one actually. When you say that a situation affords, what would you say that first a situation affords reading, or would you say that each situation will afford some action? And
like you said, would I say a situation affords reading versus action?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Because Tom McClelland, who works with affordances a lot, and he recently argued that a book affords reading, and he talked about a whole lot of mental affordances. I'm not going in this direction, but when you talk about the reading of a situation, and because you're using the concept of affordances to approach your the relational nature there, I was wondering if we can determine like a cup affords gripping and a situation affords, and then for example a party affords dancing. Would we go for that? Would we go for things that a situation can afford, or are you just staying in? When you talk about the emotional perception, you're saying that a situation affords let's say the emotional reading. Yeah.
I would have to think about it like more. Like I don't mind like pushing Gibson's concepts, and I think Gibson was too narrow in his thinking. Like when he tried to sort of, you know, separate affordances from like emotions, or even his realist stuff. I don't like this notion of like, and again, and activists play this up where they'll say we're different because we're constructivists, and I'm like, it's all the same if you read it pragmatically. Like you know, Dewey's like, we introduce changes to the environment. Once we introduce them, they're there. We construct them, but they're there. Okay. So, but like, you know, but like it's like I guess like I don't mind if people push the concept, and even in the published version, I actually probably pushed. I know like Gibsonians would be upset with me now that I've learned more about Gibsonian psychology, you know, I don't mind pushing things, but at the same time, like I think we want to kind of retain like the usefulness of the concept, and there's a lot of stuff that you can explain through Gibson's way. So would Gibson count like reading as being an affordance? I don't know. Does it mean we can't? I don't know. I don't really have a good answer, to be honest. But I do think that like, yeah, I do think that we register affordances with emotional tones. Now I don't think Gibson would dispute that, but he would say the emotional tones are relevant to, you know, whether it's affordance or not. I'm not sure whether Gibson's right in that. Like, these are kind of things I would really have to think about more, and so I don't really have a good answer right now, so I apologize. Yeah, good question though. I mean, excellent question, but like these are obviously issues that a lot of people are struggling with currently.
Okay, thank you, Nara. Felipe is back. So should we try again, Felipe?
Yes, perfect timing, right? Just I was about to start, had a power shortage here. By the way, it's the second time it happens this morning, so it happens again, just no, go ahead without me, but hopefully it won't happen again. So finally, I'll share my screen. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, wow, I'm nervous. Well prepared.
Okay, so just to contextualize my comments real quick, I just start with a bit of history. We all seen this with in Krippen's presentation, but as he said, in the 60s and 70s, there was a very popular theory in psychology which held that we easily perceive emotions in faces because we have a sort of hardwire mechanism that's tuned to detecting certain morphological configurations of facial muscles. One of the persons most responsible for this view is Paul Ekman, and he wrote that it is the morphology, the momentary configuration produced by the contraction of a particular set of facial muscles that provides information about whether it's anger, fear, disgust, sadness, surprise, or enjoyment. And this weird view has two important consequences that are directly relevant to our discussion here. The first point is that, well, if morphology is all that matters, then we don't need to include the subject's engagement with the person whose face one is perceiving in our account of emotion perception. And secondly, if morphology is all that matters, then the way we perceive expressive qualities in faces and in environments will turn out to be completely different things, since environments do not have morphological facial configurations for us to perceive. So in this paper, Crippen denies both of these points. And of course, the most effective way of resisting these undesirable consequences is to change the theory of emotion perception that leads to these points. So this is exactly what he does in the paper. So just to quickly reconstruct his account for dialectical purposes, he argues, as we've seen, that we do not perceive faces in isolation, but as parts of interconnected wholes, which are situations. So that the context in which a face is perceived changes the emotion perceived. That's what these Kuleshov-like scenarios are supposed to show. And in fact, as he said, morphology is so secondary to emotion perception that it's possible to perceive emotion in a face even when the person is wearing a mask. That's what we get from the Vader studies. If emotion perception is about morphology, then this shouldn't happen. So what is important to keep in mind here from this quick reconstruction is that emotion perception is not about sensing outward signs of internal states, but about being suitably sensitive to affordances in situations. And when he proposes this view, this allows him to counter both points that I have previously alluded to in Krippen's theory. Now the subject engagements with the world turn out to be central for emotion perception because, well, affordances are ecological relations. And secondly, if we're tracking affordances in situations, then the perception of faces and environments will turn out to be quite similar after all. I have to say I am quite sympathetic to this view, to his overall project, so that his contribution to the field must be praised and welcomed. I'm fully on board with the idea of understanding emotion perception in terms of ecological relations. However, in my commentary today, I'd just like to press his account on two different points. The first concerns how much of an explanatory gain we actually achieve by assimilating perception of persons to perceptions of environments. And the second concerns how exactly should we make sense of the claim that this perception is infused with value and how this shows up in perceptual experience. So in the rest of the time that I have left, just tackle each of these points in turn. So regarding the first point, we can start by asking how similar is person perception to environment perception? Is perceiving anger in a romantic partner the same as perceiving anger in moving clouds that precede a thunderstorm? So passages like this, which we can get a lot of these quotes from Crippen, he says, we read human faces like environmental spaces, namely as affordances grounded in relations. Well, I grant that at a certain level of analysis, both person and environment perception can be described as the perception of what the situation affords us. Nevertheless, I wonder if this is the right level of analysis to understand what is going on in person perception, which is, after all, one of the main questions that Crippen deals with in his paper. So when I see that the clouds are angry, for example, then I perceive the situation that tells me I should find shelter, or perhaps, if I'm already safe indoors, I may perceive a situation that affords contemplation. But what I don't get from the situation is a sense that how the anger of the clouds will unfold depends crucially on what I do in relation to them. So regardless of practice of rain dances and rain rituals or talk of being in communion with nature, the behavior of rain clouds is just indifferent to my existence. But we could argue this is a crucial feature of emotion perception in social interactions. And this might just be enough reason to keep both of these things separate at a certain level. So when I perceive anger in my partner, for example, I perceive more than just a situation that affords confronting or that affords escape. There's a clear sense in which I perceive, as I grasp the situation, is that how her anger will unfold depends crucially on what I'm about to do next. So whether I respond with an offensive remark or I remain indifferent or make an apology will influence how the emotion will unfold in time, as well as the status of my relationship with her at that time. So the emotion I perceive in her is like an invitation for me to dynamically change the status of our relationship in time, in terms of my own affective and bodily responses and the results I expect from these responses on her. So anger here, as I perceive, is a dynamic process of adjustment of two agents in tune with the unfolding of their relationship in time. And this is not so in the case of rain clouds passing over my head, just signaling I should find shelter. So just to conclude this first point, I agree with Crippen that emotion perception is not a matter of sensing outward signs of internal states, but a matter of perceiving what the situation affords us. At this level of analysis, it is certainly true that perceiving expressive qualities in persons and in environments may both be described in this manner. But I'm wondering if this is the right level of analysis to understand what is involved in person perception, in terms of this kinds of social dynamic coupling that we enter with people. This might be both of this separate. My second point concerns the idea that's much emphasized in these papers, that perception is infused with value. So as he says, we see rivers as treacherous, rain clouds as angry, path as alluring and mysterious, and so on, which are consequences of our ecological relations. But how should we unpack this claim? And more importantly, how does it affect our perception experience of the world? So one way to understand this claim is through Dennis Profit's view of perception as phenotypic expression, which Crippen cites approvingly in his paper. So Profit claims that the perceptual ruler used to scale the spatial world changes as a function of things like our action potential, our affective states, motivational states, and so on. So how we perceive magnitudes such as length, width, size, and distance actually depends on how we happen to be engaged with the world at that time. So he says that value can actually change the perceived spatial layout of the world. So that's why, when you have a heavy backpack, a hill to be climbed may look steeper, a distance to be walked may look longer. When we are afraid, a spider may look closer than it is. The ground may look further away than it is. A hill to be descended on a skateboard looks steeper relative than we are on foot, and so on. But there is another interpretation of these results. This concerns changes in how we feel that the world affords certain actions, and not in the way that the spatial magnitudes perceptually appear to us. For example, what happens when we put on a heavy backpack is that a hill that afforded climbing with ease now affords climbing with difficulty. And when we're faced with this kind of change, we often say things like, well, I can see perfectly well that this hill is not very steep, but when I'm climbing with this heavy backpack on, it just feels twice as steep, And these kinds of statements, they bring out the difference between our perceptions of the world and our impressions, our feelings of how the world affords certain actions under different conditions. But of course, and this is my point here, a hill may be felt as harder to climb without looking any steeper. And the problem in these studies is that subjects are only given a spatial estimation task to perform. So it is possible that they are actually expressing their change impressions through the only means they have available, which is spatial overestimations, rather than reporting on how the world perceptually appears. There is one study that probes exactly into these two possibilities, which is studied by Woods and collaborators from 2009. So this study, they attempted to replicate previous findings that whether you throw a heavy ball or a light ball affects how you perceive distance to a certain target. But here, rather than just presenting subjects with the spatial estimation task, they asked three different sets of questions. They told people to base their response on how far away they think the object is, how far away the object visually appears, and how far away they feel the object is. And here they found this sort of distance is only in the third condition, which might corroborate the distinction between our perceptions of the spatial world and our impressions or feelings of the way the world affords certain actions under different conditions. So perhaps the only reason that people were reporting hills as steeper when they were in heavy backpack is that these feelings were not properly distinguished from perceptions in these experimental tasks. So to conclude, I agree that perception is infused with value and that when we change our actual potential or our affective and motivational states, we experience a change in how we feel that the world affords certain actions to us. So when I mount on a skateboard, a hill that was felt as easily descendable when I was on foot is now felt as harder to descend or less descendable without looking any steeper. This is what I'm calling our impressions of the world, just our feelings of effort and the risks the world poses to us. But I'm disputing the fact that value can actually change how we perceive the spatial layout of the world. Well, this is all I have to say for today. Just finishing by reaffirming that I really enjoyed the paper and that it touches on two very important points that I fully endorse. First, that emotion perception has to do with situated action and not with detecting morphological features as signs of internal states. I'm on board with that. And also that our perception is infused with value. I'm also on board with that. So the 2 points I raised here only concern certain specific ways to cash out these two claims. And so I'm just wondering whether some finer distinctions are needed to properly understand what is going on in person perception and environment perception, and also in understanding how value might change our perceptions of the world. So in this sense, this commentary should be taken more as friendly suggestions for clarification rather than objections per se. Okay, so that's it. I'm curious to say what Kripin have to say about that.
Thought and work you put into that. That's amazing. And I'll say in passing, by the way, like I did an invited talk like in, I think 2019 in Columbia, and I was super impressed with the level of the scholarship. I think unfortunately there's this language barrier that people, they just don't understand how good, and I don't unfortunately speak romantic languages. So I think it's kind of a tragedy because I think there's like so much good scholarship going on in South America right now. But okay, so some of your questions were, can you actually, so you started out with Ekman and so forth. So I think like we don't need to be too ideologically extreme or anything. So Ekman, he annoys me. Okay. But having said that, I think there's like, of course there's truth to what he's saying. So I don't think we have to like say Ekman is completely wrong. We don't need to be ideological extremists. So that's one thing I would point out. I do actually think that that your action capacities and your emotional state, I would actually argue that it affects distance perception. But I think it's really difficult to tease out because I think like we're, as phenomenologists said, we're always kind of in this natural attitude, and the natural attitude today is a scientific attitude where we're basically told, even though we actually know that space isn't absolute, but we're told that space is absolute. This is, 2 meters, it doesn't change. I think we actually lose touch with how emotion laden space is. But I mean, if you think about your experience of being in a, traffic and how you experience space so much differently and you experience time so much differently. And I walk a lot, like hours a day, typically. Like I hike into the mountains. I do my grocery shopping on foot, and and of course I know, like if you're measuring out the distance, say I particularly remember when I used to live in Egypt. I used to kind of walk home like after a really long day, maybe carrying a lot of weight, and of course I know that the distance is the same distance if you're measuring out in meters. but for me, it would kind of look further, and the experience would be, it would be an experience of struggle. And so I think part of the reason why you get some of the results that contest Prophet's views, I think because basically it's ingrained in us that, you know, we measure things in meters, meters are absolute. So in Merleau-Ponty's language, it's because we're always already kind of in what Merleau-Ponty calls these second order modes. And by the way, Merleau-Ponty's not putting down science. He thinks it's really, really important. But I think a lot of times we kind of have this disconnect from lived experience. But again, that's a really hard thing to demonstrate empirically. So it could be that I'm wrong. And it could be that, you know, my experience doesn't track to most people's experience, or it could even be that maybe I'm distorted in my views. But that's, it's not really, it's not really a counter to what you're saying, because, like, you know, could I demonstrate this empirically? It'd be pretty tough. So I think your objections are legitimate, but that would be how I would answer that particular comment. In terms of the world being infused with value, I mean, I think it unequivocally is, and I think it affects everything. I mean, I think that for me, I think like action, cognition, emotion, all of these things are always like fused. So when I see a you know, say like an ice covered river, you know, and that I want to cross, you know, I might register that as being dangerous. I'll perceive the danger. I'll perceive it as being emotionally threatening. I'll simultaneously, you know, categorize it in that way. So I think this actually is important, understanding our engagements with the world. And I think without these emotional tones, I think it would be much more difficult to function as we do. I don't know whether it was very long. I mean, it's a very interesting counter, but I have a short-term memory issue, so it's hard for me to hold everything you said in my head. But if you want me to address anything more specifically, like, I invite you to raise it now, and I'm happy to try to respond to the best of my ability.
Just a clarification. I agree that no, the perception is infused with value and these emotionally laden words, as you said. So the point is that there seems to be a difference between, say, just this space feels tighter than it is, and it looks tighter. So this sort of feelings that we get from how the world affords and actions, this shows up at the level of perception, but perhaps not in the spatial layout of the world per se. So this is just the point that I was raising. So I'm not saying that no, the space is objective, it's 2 meters and that's it. You know, we feel things to be bigger and smaller.
Oops.
The world as we see it.
Yeah, no, so I think these are interesting distinctions. I think that, you know, probably, I think it bears more scrutiny. I think the way things feel and the way they look, but again, right now I'm talking from my first-hand experience, so that's not going to be acceptable if you're publishing like in you know, the Journal of Perception or whatever. Okay, but from my first-hand experience, I find that like the way things look and the way they feel are intimately bound. I tend to be like a pretty emotional guy, so maybe that's part of it, you know. And I've been through some shit. I've been marched at gunpoint, and, you know, and that's, it's made me sort of react maybe more strongly to things than I otherwise would. So I think they're intimately bound. But having said that, like, I think it's an important distinction that you're raising. I think it's worthy of more scrutiny. And it could be, if I looked into this more, you know, both phenomenologically, but supposing either I started reading the empirical literature more, or doing my own research, it's quite possible that I would find bases for making that distinction. And so I don't have an obvious counter aside from saying, you know, that's how I experience it. And of course, in my experience, that's how it is. But again, that doesn't seem to be how you experience it. Now, I would kind of, maybe my position would be that you're, you know, in this sort of what, you know, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty would call the natural attitude. I don't mean it in a demeaning way. Okay, but I could be wrong in that. You know, it could even be that I'm in a weird natural attitude, you know, that's distorting my view. So I think I would argue they're intimately bound, but I think it's a really interesting distinction you're raising. I think it's one that's worthy of a lot more scrutiny and attention. So I thank you for drawing my attention to that.
I also have some people stay waiting in line to ask questions. So just let other people speak. Then we have time at the end. We can talk more about this thing. So thank you for your
well, thank you for the very detailed. I'm very flattered you were so detailed in your response. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Felipe. Now, Marco Aurelio has a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. That was a very interesting talk, and I really enjoyed reading your paper a lot. Even though I don't personally agree with a lot of that, but that doesn't matter. I mean, it's a really good work. And I am interested here in how you understand the scope of perception. What actually is this perceiving relation? And so I'm going to try to explain what my worry here is all about. You said that you have this, Hitchcock's smile. And at a certain point in your paper, you say that his smile looks different. We shall not over intellectualize that. So it's not that we infer certain emotions out of the situation. So of course, now we have the montage. So we have a certain situation and we read certain emotions out of it, right? And you said that it's not inferred because it happens all at once. Immediately, you are somehow immediately related to, you just see the emotions in there, right? In a certain way. That sounds okay to me, but then here is my problem. When you relate to a certain situation, and I like the idea of substituting faces or even mind reading for situation reading, because of course it's more complex. That's what you're really related to in order to be able to read emotions out of people's behavior or faces, whatever. So that sounds okay. But now I am concerned about the specific relation. What's the kind of relation the agent, the subject has with the situation? Is it a relation of perceiving per se? And now here is why I think that sounds weird to me somehow. So maybe my question very shortly is there any difference between how the situation strikes you? So it may strikes you as being a certain, the person having a certain emotion. If it strikes you in a certain way, do you perceive whatever you can take out of this relation you have with the situation? Or can you realize or, have some other kinds of relations to the situation? So here is my example. Suppose you have this couple and they have been married for 20 years and they have this argument and the guy says, now I realize, and so there is the situation in which they are arguing and the guy says, now I realize you have never loved me, and you look cynical, right? What is the situation, the relevant situation, 20 years of marriage? Because of course, the whole kind of a narrative is relevant to realizing this fact, right? And reading it out of this situation they find themselves in. It's not something to be found in the immediate environment, in her face. It's probably something that, even if it happened immediately, I mean, it strikes him immediately as, oh, you have never loved me, right? It's not something that is inferred. It's not over intellectualized. It's just 20 years of marriage, an argument, and the guy realizing that actually she has been false to him all this, years or whatever. Is it perceived? I mean, maybe my question is, what is the scope of a situation that can be perceived? And if it's too broad, maybe should we still talk about a relation of perceiving or maybe realizing or some other more cognitive loaded relation, which is not just to perceive, but to realize or to, it includes, of course, it's going to have some element of some inferential elements and so on, even if it's not conscious, it's not over intellectualized, it happens, immediately, but it's still, not everything that happens at once is perception. And I think that maybe there is something weird, at least to me, about taking everything that a situation can give to you, and the situation is not limited in any way. It can go back like 20 years, I don't know. And all that is perceived. So yeah, maybe that's my worry. I want to hear you about it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So to begin with, I'm not against including cognition. So my basic view, to give it in brief, and it comes from Dewey and Merleau-Ponty, is basically that cognition, the kind of there's sort of four modes of kind of registering the world, and Merleau-Ponty actually argues they're all perceptual in phenomenology of perception, but he he actually argues that cognition is a way of perceiving, and that emotion is a way of perceiving, and that you know what we classically regard as sense perception is a way of perceiving, and that motility is a way of perceiving. And I would argue that, because I think everything sort of affects, you know, how the world shows up. So I worked at tree farms. I did machete work for years at Christmas tree farms, but like I can see differences between, like, say, spruce trees and fir trees that maybe the average person can't. And I see them, okay, but it's something I learned over time. And there's definitely some cognition involved. And so I don't mean to deny that there's cognition involved. Like when I say it's over intellectual, my point is I think it is poor wording to say, like, we sit there and we're like, you know, like Hitchcock's smile is paired with a bikini. Therefore, okay, I'm going to do a logical derivation. Yes, you know, the smile must be dirty. I think we see it immediately. So that's all I'm basically trying to say in everyday language. But of course, there's you know, cognitive processes going on, but I don't really view cognitive processes as being separate from percent. I've never even understood these distinctions, to be honest. Like I think it's all kind of related. And even if you're talking about the brain, in the brain, it definitely is all sort of relating in terms of like a situation. No, I think you know, 20 years of marriage would be a situation, and but to give, and you know, and like, is there a difference between striking, perceiving, and realizing? I mean, maybe, you know, I'm not like ideal. I'm not going to like die on that mountain. I'd be willing to grant, like, yeah, we could say maybe there's a bit of a difference between how things strike us, maybe how we immediately perceive them about realizing something. But what I would also add is that, like, broad sort of situations definitely change how things show up. So a lot of my research actually looks at like urban design in the context of, I've especially written a lot on Cairo because I used to live there. And if you're looking at something like Tahrir Square, which is where I presume you guys know that the Arab Spring that was sort of centered there in Egypt, but I don't know how much that hit Brazilian news, and this is now 10 years ago. But it's gone through multiple redesigns. But one of the redesigns, I would say the square is selectively permeable. So if you're a tourist, you're probably not going to register it as being threatening, okay? But if you're an Egyptian, like, you immediately see it as like fuck you. That's like, they have a flag in the middle. The flag is like literally like, fuck you, stay the fuck out of here. And you see it as being threatening and dangerous. But part of this is because if you're carrying the cultural background. Now we can even add like the prophet stuff in here, because Egyptians are culturally exhausted. They're like a country that's been punched in the face, gotten up and punched in the face again. Like, my heart breaks for Egypt. I mean, there's countries that have gone through worse, but it's close to me because I lived there. But again, like, so this is like a broad kind of cultural situation that affects, you know, how you'll perceive the square. I mean, likewise, you know, like, you know, say if you live in a slightly dangerous city, then let's say if you're watching, like, you know, programs all the time that basically, I mean, there's all sorts of police procedurals that tell you if you're a woman, you're going to be raped, murdered, cut up, you know, all this other stuff, which, you know, we could argue maybe that's so you'll get the impression that you need like a man to take care of you and all this other crap. You know, but again, like, that could really affect your experience of the environment. But again, if the city actually is more dangerous and a woman perceived it as being more dangerous, I don't think her perception is skewed. Okay, but again, like, so men and women are going to probably perceive urban spaces differently, and this is partly because of like this cultural background, but it also has to do with like threats that are really there. But it's a pretty broad situation. If you take the Kairos, I mean, the Arab Spring now is 10 years ago, and they had the most recent redesign, you know, like a year ago, and then it was like maybe 2015 that they had another redesign. So it's like 5 years on, okay, but like, and I think it was done intentionally. I don't think it's the right. I don't think you probably know about like Oscar Newman's Defensible Space, but they were, you know, literally kind of incorporating these design features into the square. But the you know, the situation involves the physical design. It involves the, you know, the cultural history, and that affects, you know, how people perceive the square. It affects how they relate to it emotionally. And so I think situations are broad, and I wouldn't want to draw a line. So sometimes we can talk about immediate situations, or I think other times we can talk about, you know, 20 years of marriage. I mean, that's definitely, you know, also a situation. But I think at the end of the day, I would say if we abstract things from situations, we misunderstand them badly. So this happens with historical texts all the time. For example, you know, people just act like they can read the words on the page and understand it without understanding the broader context. So I think I mostly agree with what you're saying. I don't really think I object to anything you're saying. I think it's all good points. And yeah, and I think to the extent that it seems like I'm saying something differently, it's probably just I'm wording things badly in the paper, perhaps. Because like you know, I don't mean to suggest that cognition isn't involved when you perceive Hitchcock's smile as being dirty in the second case.
Right. Thank you.
Good.
Okay, thank you. We have 4 or 5 questions to go, so I'm going to ask you to keep it brief in the next few minutes because we're approaching 11 o'clock here and it's 11 night over there where Matthew is. So next in line is Andrea.
All right, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this as well.
Thank you.
Someone who also comes from a broadly Merleau-Pontian framework, so I'm really sympathetic. When it comes to scholarship, I just missed a bit of, I think Sartre has pointed to a more similar to your views than Merleau-Ponty, I think, when it comes to emotions and situations. I was also wondering about situations of this, like Nara and Marco Aurelio as well. So I think that, at least in the phenomenological tradition, situations are something like events and fears with meaning, if you want to give a broad definition of situations. And there's a general question, which is of interest to Merleau-Ponty and to Sartre as well, which is how situations come to have the meaning they do for us. And something I missed in the whole literature, here I mean the phenomenological literature, is how narratives, they are important to make situations actually come about for us. So I think we're not over-intellectualizing anything. I think if we say that we are telling stories about ourselves, telling stories about the world, and that these stories, they have an important role to play in making situations come about for us, as they do. And I don't think this needs to be over-intellectualized. So we're not, like Marco Aurelio said, we don't have to be constantly constructing a story and telling a story to ourselves. This may be subconscious process, so some of it might be inferential, some of it might not be inferential. Some of it, of course, will be based on memory. Some of these memories will be episodic memory, but it also might be some autobiographical memory playing a role here. But in general, I think a narrative approach to situations would be useful for someone like you and for people working on this broadly pragmatist and phenomenological tradition who wants to explain how situations get to have the meaning they do, and how this kind of meaning gets to affect our lives.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly on mark. So like, I think in like an original, this paper, by the way, it went through quite a few, like reviewers really didn't like the paper. Like with the issue I published in, like the Syntheses people didn't give me a hard time, but actually I tried like for some lesser journals, and there's just got like, you know, when the reviewers, they want to like rip out your guts and like stomp on them and make you feel like, I mean, so like there was a lot of resistance. I went through a lot of instantiations, but at one point there was a little more on narrative. I'm very sympathetic too, because Dewey, like in his work, I actually just submitted a piece on, you know, narrativity, but like Dewey holds even on, you know, even in immediate experience, he tends to hold his narrative. And then especially when he's talking about aesthetic experience, I mean, his understanding of aesthetic experience is when things hold together dramatically as a whole. So this can happen with a painting where your eye kind of roams around the canvas and then, you know, kind of, you know, goes to various focal points, but there's drama there, you know, in movies and so forth. He talks about, you know, aesthetic experience being a union of the unsettled and the assured. And what he means by this is like, have aesthetic experience, you know, you need some predictability. So if I just go out and take like random shots of, you know, stuff and throw it together and say, this is my film, it probably isn't going to give you the ultimate aesthetic experience. But at the same time, if it's just kind of completely mechanical and formulaic, you know, it's probably not going to be aesthetic either. So Dewey talks about drama it kind of needs some predictability, but the unexpected twist and so forth. And there's even a lot of literature, like you know, maybe some of you know, I can never pronounce the first name, but the last name is Treverthon, but like a major developmental researcher. But when he's talking about, to begin with, he talks about infant experience being embodied and kind of being like a situation where the infant and the caregiver, it's almost like, you know, kind of a merging of minds where their actions are so interlocked that they have kind of joint experience. But he also talks about how you get, you know, aesthetics and sort of narrative formation. He actually argues even prenatally. Okay, so I think, yeah, I mean, I would agree that, you know, narrativity is, you know, a really useful way of understanding situations. And when we explain them, like when I'm trying to explain the Cairo situation, I mean, I didn't articulate it, the best in terms of a story. I didn't have this climactic moment, but again, when we're trying to explain situations, we convey them in terms of stories. So I think it's an excellent observation. I think that would be another place for like future research in this area. So I thank you for, because I although I'm doing some work in narrative, I hadn't really like, and even though the paper originally had a little bit, I hadn't really thought about that until you mentioned it. So I appreciate the comment. And I hadn't, and even when I say it had a little bit, it wasn't really well developed. Like, it was just like kind of a little touched upon it, but it wasn't well developed. So yeah, I think yeah, good observations.
Very much. Thanks.
Okay, next in line is Eros.
Thank you, Matthew, for your presentation. Really like it. I have just a few questions about Gibson approach.
Okay.
In relation to Kafka and Gibson's agreement, I think that maybe the distinction between perceiving an affordance and the selection of affordance may be helpful, because I do not need to be hungry now to perceive that an apple, for example, is edible, but I need to be hungry to select this affordance to act upon. So I think that this distinction may be helpful to distinguish the position between Kafka and Gibson. But my question, the really question that I have is the following. When you extend the notion of affordance as you did, so to encompass affordances of situations and so on, the worry that Gibsonians may have is about the notion of information. So do we have information about, for example, a mountain affording mysteriousness? And it's not clear to me that we have environmental information about that. So I would like to hear you say something more about information. That's a notion that doesn't appear on paper, but for Gibsonians is very important. So this will be my question, and a very short comment. I think there is a strong parallel between your discussion about Kuleshov effect and Wittgenstein discussion about the phenomena of seeing as. So if you say something more about that, or the relation between these discussions. So again, thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay, so like to begin with Kafka versus Gibson, I mean, yeah, of course there's differences. I'm not disputing that, but I think like you get this, and I'm not even saying Gibson's doing it intentionally, but you get this thing in academia. I think the differences are much stronger than Gibson recognized. Even when Gibson talks about like the difference between, I can't really see like the geometric world and the behavioral world and Gestalt psychology, and this is where I'm different because I'm just talking about things being objective and so forth. I think he's not giving a charitable approach of Gestalt psychology, because I think the distinction between the behavior world and the geometric world, it's kind of like the difference between like, lived world and phenomenology in second order. But more broadly, like in Gibson, you get this thing where he's trying to differentiate himself from Gibson. Then an activist do the same thing to Gibson again. And I think a lot of it's bullshit. Like I think in like Varela's work where they're like, we're so different than Gibson, bullshit. You're really not. I wrote a paper on this, so you can like, people can argue with me about this, but like so that's a brief point, but wasn't your main point. In terms of the Gibsonians would be concerned about, the lack of discussion about information and whether you actually are, getting, information about, say, like the emotional turbulence of storm clouds or something like that. I think from a Gibsonian standpoint, it's a legitimate objection. And so like, I guess as an academic, you're never meant to admit weakness, but like if I had to rewrite the paper at this point, I would make the same arguments I'm making, but I would clarify and point out that, like a lot of what Gibson is saying is different than what I'm saying, because again, for Gibsonians, like environmental information is meant to be sufficient for perception. I don't even talk about environmental information in the paper. So I think that's a legitimate criticism. I think the parallel I'm trying to draw between what I'm saying and what Gibson says is that, Gibson is arguing that affordances aren't in your head, that it's like that. I mean, somebody will say they're kind of like, they're neither subjective or objective. I mean, Dewey talks in the same ways that subject and object are built up in one and the same continuing operation, also Merleau-Ponty, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think the claim I would still maintain in the paper is that, you know, these emotional qualities and environments, I would still maintain they have sort of an ontological status, the same sort of ontological status as affordances, because again, to have an affordance, you have to have an organism with capacities and an environment that places limits on it. And I would argue that the emotional qualities are showing up for these reasons. But I would, you know, if I was to rewrite it, I would kind of, you know, reframe some of the discussions of Gibson to indicate that, you know, like, you know, there's obviously, you know, departures from what Gibson says and what I'm saying. And then in terms of Wittgenstein, I mean, I haven't really thought specifically about the portions you're talking about, and I haven't read Wittgenstein in a long time, but I do see Wittgenstein as being a philosophical ally. Like, so for me, like, I actually, you know, I was research assistant to a guy named Stuart Shanker, who at the time was like one of the top 10 Wittgenstein scholars in the English speaking world. But I wrote a paper on, like, you know, phenomenology and Wittgenstein. But I see especially the later Wittgenstein is basically, you know, doing phenomenology, and he actually used the term. And so I think that, yeah, I think he's an ally who could be brought into this line of work. I think he's very, you know, consonant with Merleau-Ponty, Dewey, you know, Heidegger. If you can get rid of some of the torturous language, I mean, you could kind of, you know, find kinships to them. So I think that he is somebody who's worth bringing in, although it's been a long time since I cracked open my Wittgenstein, and the Wittgenstein I've looked at is mainly the later stuff, which does include the stuff you're talking about, but it's been a long time since I've taken a look at that. So it's something I should definitely look at again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Raquel, please.
Hi, thank you, Matthew. Well, I think some of my worries have already appeared in Felipe's and Marco Aurelio's comments, but I'll say them anyway. So I think it's important to make this distinction between perceptual and post-perceptual effects. And I was wondering if you tried to do that in the experiment you conducted. So whether you try to rule out post-perceptual interpretation of the results, or anyway, of people's, what people report experiencing. And I don't know, I guess I'm a little skeptical that we can make this distinction just by what people report about their experiences. So I don't know, I don't think people are reliable. People are, you know, they're not used to make these subtle distinctions between what they actually perceive and what they conclude or judge or believe about their experiences, given contextual information or other sorts of information they might have. So this one worry I have is, can you really conclude that people are actually experiencing Darth Vader's mask as expressing different emotions just by asking them something?
Okay.
And I also, I don't think you can rely on just, you know, what you introspectively think about it. So for instance, I watch the videos and I can say that, well, I'm not sure. Like, I don't know if to me, it doesn't feel like there's a perceptual difference, I would say, but maybe I'm saying that just because, you know, I don't believe that. So I have theoretical preferences that are different from yours.
So, yeah, no, like, I think, like, I have a degree in psychology, but when I did this, like, I mean, my degree was like many years out, and I mean, the statistical analysis I did was like totally like baby statistics, and I had to work hard to kind of like even like reacquire the knowledge to do that. So, you know, my methods were not very sophisticated. So of course I wasn't like, you know, it didn't even occur to me to, you know, try to, you know, differentiate perception from post-perceptual effects. And I grant that, and I don't, you know, it's difficult to even know how you would do that. And I also agree that like self-reports are not the most reliable. And while I'm criticizing, like, I mean, you know, psychology, obviously, I mean, I think all of us take it seriously, but like even one problem is I think a lot of times when you set up an experiment, that a lot of times you're funneling behaviors into ways that they wouldn't occur in the everyday world. Like you're changing the behaviors. Okay, so those are all legitimate comments. Now, you know, I would be surprised if you didn't see the Hitchcock smile as at least being dirty if you're watching it on a non-distorted screen, but you can tell me how you experience that. Like I've never met anybody who doesn't see the smile as being dirty. But it's, you know, if you don't see it that way, then you don't see it that way. I can't argue with you. But my intent was, so like on earlier versions of the paper, you know, I didn't do an experiment. That's one thing that the reviewers went after me for. You know, they're like, you know, even they're like discussion groups aren't reliable. You know, your first person self-report isn't reliable. But I do think there's a degree of reliability. Like, I mean, phenomenologically, Hitchcock smile, it looks dirty, and so far I haven't encountered a person who doesn't have that experience. So maybe you're the first person. And then when you combine that, and again, if you don't, I mean, it's fine. You know, like, and if you combine that with the experimental results, then I think the finding is fairly compelling. Now we can still sort of debate what's going on. Like, is it truly perceptual or is it post-perceptual? For me, it's perceptual. Like for me, the smile looks different. Like I experience a perceptual difference between them, but maybe even like what I like. But again, your objections, I think, would be pretty difficult to handle. So I would have to think very carefully about how one would try to address your I think they're legitimate objections, but yeah.
Yeah. So of course I find the smile disgusting. So of course I find the whole situation disgusting. But I'm still perfectly capable of saying. So when you put the one image right above the other, I can still say they look exactly the same. I don't see any difference, you know, even though one causes repulsion and the other doesn't. So I think the difference is mainly in the effects that, you know, they cause on me. But we don't have to assume that the effects result only from what I see. The effects can themselves be occur because of I know about the situation. So
yeah, like I guess too, like I suppose, like, to give a little bit of background about like my theoretical, I'm trying to think of a demeaning way to put it, my theoretical I guess biases. Like again, I tend to not like sort of all this chopping up of psychic experience. To me, I find it kind of like a little bit meaningless. Like at one point, like I have a sense of what people mean when they ask what differences between like cognition and emotion. But one time I was asked this at a conference, like I don't even know, I can't even articulate the difference, you know. And so for me, like cognition and emotion and perception, they're so bound up in one another. But that also could be because I mean, I do have a degree in psychology, but in terms of philosophy, like even before I was studying philosophy, it was like Dewey, Merleau-Ponty, you know, people that advance these views. So maybe this changes, you know, how I see things. But I tend to find sort of the, you know, the dissection of psychic experience as being problematic, because I don't think that's how we experience the world. But again, here we're getting into subjective experiences. So again, if you experience it in your way and I experience it in my way, I suspect probably both our ways of experiencing are probably filtered through our theoretical biases. And so like, how do you tease all this out? I have no idea. I mean, it's an interesting problem. I think, you know, you could probably do many papers on that topic. So I think it's a really interesting, you know, objection you raise. I don't really have a good answer to it aside from the one I just gave.
Okay, and now to the last question. Julia, is that correct pronunciation of your name?
Almost, it's Julia.
Julia, okay, thank you.
So my question is about your interpretation of the Avizer and colleagues experiments on people or not but perceiving extreme happiness as extreme sadness and so on, then the body and the face are reversed. And I think that these experiments actually don't really support contextual effects on emotion perception. If anything, they actually show the limits of contextual effects on emotion perception, because these experiments only occur in cases of facial expression expressing really high arousal, and they don't work if the arousal is average. So in both of the cases that you introduced, so the Hitchcock case and the Mosz-Zhuchin's case, which was used by Kuleshov, Mazurkin's face is rather neutral, so it's easy to project different kinds of emotions in the face. And similarly, in Hitchcock's case, both of these the smiles that he shows are within the same, let's say, valence category. Just in one case, we interpreted it as a paternal smile, and in the other case, we interpreted it as a smile of lust, but it's the same valence category. So it seems to me that actually, if we take emotional expressions, not in cases of really high arousal, where the facial expression is so deformed that it's really difficult to detect the features, and if we take cases of, let's say, average or normal emotional expressions, it seems that there is something that's constant independently from the context. And this is at least the affective valence that's expressed in the face. And this would be, to come back to Raquel's question, maybe the perceptual aspect of social perception, perceptual emotion. And then in this, let's say, at least initial step, when there might be afterwards some contextual effects taking place.
Yeah, so I think like you raise a good point too that I hadn't really. I mean, I would still stand by my claim, and I'll try to give a defense. But I think when you're talking about the experimental research, so my criticism of Ekman is that he uses really exaggerated. Well, I have many criticisms of Ekman, but one of my criticisms is he uses really overly exaggerated facial expressions. But you're right, like with the Abazier and colleagues studies too. I mean, especially the way they have like the head grafted onto the body. I mean, it's also equally exaggerated. So that's something I really hadn't taken account of. So I think that's like a legitimate criticism of that work. And if they didn't, you know, if they had less like, and I mean also like even I mean I like. My understanding is they actually took a face and a body from a tennis victory, but like, you know, if you just like one, like I don't know, like the God, my memory's going. What's the one in the UK, the most famous one again? Oh, Wimbledon. Yeah, if you just won Wimbledon, like you're going to be like pretty like you know, effusive, and so like I think that's legitimate criticism, but at the same time, it's hard to explain how you get the Vader effect then, because Vader's face has to be pretty neutral. I mean, that has to be like equivalent to Mazurkin, and then with quite a bit more. Now, again, the Vader effect isn't quite as strong, but it's still strong. Now, again, we could have these post perceptual effects going on with the Vader account, and I don't really know how to tease that out. I mean, I do experience the Vader effect, although at this point I maybe have seen it so many times I experience it less. The original context in which I use that was actually just to actually teach a little bit about the Kuhn-Schaff effect for research. But again, like the Vader effect is an interesting one because again, that's like, it's a mask. And you know, I think like I would invite people maybe to just click on the link in the paper and see if they experience it or not. I don't know, maybe you don't, but if you do, then that's an interesting effect. But I think you're correct in suggesting that the, you know, the work on like body posture and expressions that kind of like, as with the Ekman research, it's pretty exaggerated. So, you know, it would be difficult. It'd be interesting to kind of, if you had examples where they're using less, you know, if they're using kind of, you know, slightly more neutral expressions and body postures, and then to see what effects you would get. I suspect they would probably be very weak. So that's an interesting objection that you raised.
Yeah, so just as a very quick follow-up, so there are other effects that are not connected with emotions. These have been discovered by the Todorov lab. So experiences and first impressions of competence, of extroversion, of dominance and trustworthiness and so on. So very high level, very complex properties like character traits. And in these cases, the subjects also say that they have experiential feelings, like a perceptual experience of seeing that someone is trustworthy. But I think this experiential feeling, well, it's really doubtful that we do see trustworthiness in a face. So the case could be a bit more convincing in the emotional case. So it could see happiness maybe, or at least an affective valence associated with happiness. But when subjects report experiential feelings or experiential perceptions of very high level properties like trustworthiness, confidence, dominance, and so on, they're using their experiences as a guide. I think it starts to be a bit more problematic. So I was wondering whether we could actually distinguish between cases where the experience is a good guide for the perceptual aspect of cognition and where it might be actually not such a good guide for.
Yeah, well, I mean, so of course, like with emotions too, there's a lot of like, there's a range of different like, so like an emotion like shame is a pretty complex emotion that even the part of the brain that it tends to activate more is sort of different than other parts of the emotion. So in terms of like dominance and so forth, like I think that I would be skeptical as to whether you could see dominance in a face, but I think you could see dominance in an overall situation. Like I think in like a film situation, for example, you could film things in such a way that I would seem dominant or that I wouldn't see dominant. And I think in certain like contexts, like when you have like, body posture combined with facial expression combined with these people interacting in certain ways, I would be willing to say that you can perceive dominance or inferiority. But again, I think a lot of what we're saying and a lot of where I think, you or I or me and other people might have a dispute, I think would also get down to how we're defining, seeing. Like I tend to have a pretty like broad and loose and open understanding of perception, which probably a lot of perception scientists would disagree with. It, my understanding is sort of, I really, really like Merleau-Ponty. It's kind of grounded in that, but it doesn't mean that I'm right. So I think that, I would be comfortable saying that we can perceive as somebody's being dominant, in a particular situation. But if, somebody who's understanding perception as being like, visual information impacting the retina, I think they would have a different understanding of that. And so, I think that's what I would say.
Okay, well, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, so that's it then. Thank you, Matthew, once more. That was great. That was very enlightening, very nice talk. And thank you all for your questions. And I think we can end the recording now. And